My name is Michael. I'm 16 years old. I've always been a quiet, introspective kid who preferred to spend time reading mystery books and writing stories in the solitude of my room. My grades were average, and my presence at school was only noticed by the few friends I had. I didn't consider myself popular, but I wasn't exactly a pariah either. I liked the anonymity and tranquility it provided. My routine was simple. Wake up early, go to school, come back home, do my homework, and then lose myself in my books and writings until bedtime. My parents, Mark and Helen, were respected figures in our small community. They seemed to be the perfect couple, always present at social events, involved in community activities, and ready to help anyone in need. To everyone, they were the ideal parents. From an early age, I noticed some peculiarities in our family life. There was an uncomfortable silence that hung over our house, something I couldn't explain. Although my parents were loving, there was a constant feeling that something wasn't right. They were too meticulous. The house was always impeccably clean, and any deviation from the routine was quickly corrected. The first signs of strangeness appeared when I was about 9 years old. One night, I woke up thirsty and went down to the kitchen. While filling a glass of water, I heard low murmurs coming from the living room. Curious, I quietly approached. There, I found my parents talking in low voices, as if they were plotting something. When they noticed my presence, their faces instantly transformed into warm smiles. But what I saw before that deeply disturbed me. There was a coldness and intensity in their eyes that I had never seen before. These moments became more frequent over the years. Small lies, suspicious behaviors, and a constant feeling that they were hiding something. Once, while playing in the attic, I found a box of old documents. Always curious, I opened the box and found old letters, some with threatening content, others with lists of names. Many of these names were familiar to me, people in our neighborhood who had disappeared over the years. My heart raced as I read those letters. The dark and threatening words contrasted with the image of perfection my parents presented to the world. I didn't know what to do with this information. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but another part couldn't ignore the growing fear inside me. The town of Maplewood was the perfect picture of a peaceful and welcoming community. Small, with tree-lined streets and carefully preserved Victorian houses, it looked like a scene out of a fairy tale. Everyone knew everyone, and the sense of community was strong. Children played freely in the streets, neighbors organized weekend barbecues, and family-owned shops thrived in the central square. Our house, a 2-story Victorian with an immaculate garden, was on a quiet street lined with old trees. The neighborhood was made up of families who had lived there for decades. The feeling of security was almost tangible, but for me, that security was tainted by a dark undercurrent. The events that began to shake this tranquility started about 7 years ago. The first victims were the Johnson family. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, neighbors for many years, mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving behind their 2 young children. The police never found any concrete clues, and the case went cold, plunging the neighborhood into a constant state of alert. Over the years, other disappearances occurred, always with a disturbing pattern. Seemingly normal people with no enemies disappeared without a trace. Next door to our house lived Mr. Thompson, a 70-year-old widower who was always cheerful and willing to help. He was a paternal figure to many of us, always ready to tell stories of bygone times. His words, however, carried a different weight for me since I began to suspect something strange about my parents. Did he know something, or was he just a potential victim of this silent terror? My closest friends, Sarah and Tom, were my safe haven amidst the chaos. Sarah, with her red hair and ever-watchful eyes, had an inquisitive mind and a fearless spirit. She was my confidant, the only person I could share my fears with. Tom, on the other hand, was the pragmatic one. Tall, with an athletic build and an easy smile, he always tried to rationalize my fears, saying I was seeing things that weren't there. Even so, he never stopped supporting me. There was also Mrs. Miller, an eccentric lady who lived at the end of the street. A widow for many years, she spent her days tending to her flower garden and weaving rugs that she sold at a local shop. Everyone considered her somewhat strange but harmless. However, I couldn't help but notice that she seemed to observe everything with a more critical eye than others. She often invited me for tea, and in her enigmatic words, she seemed to suggest that she knew more about the disappearances than she let on. Despite all these characters and events, life went on. Children still played ball in the park, shops still opened their doors every morning, and people still smiled at each other on the sidewalks. Nights in Maplewood were quiet, but in my house, the silence brought a constant sense of unease. I tried to keep my normal routine, but small incidents began to occur, increasing my suspicions and feeding my fear. It all started with whispered conversations I overheard coming from my parents' bedroom. One night, while returning from a bathroom trip, I passed by the dark hallway and heard muffled voices. I pressed my ear against the slightly open door and could make out fragments of sentences. "We need to be more careful. He can't find out. The next name on the list." My heart raced, and I silently retreated, trying to process what I had just heard. Were my parents discussing their plans? Who was the next on the list? On another occasion, while tidying up the living room, I found a notebook hidden behind the couch. It was an old leather-bound diary with detailed notes about people in our neighborhood. There were dates, times, and strange observations. Seen at the corner of 5th and Elm at 6 p.m., left the house at 7 a.m., returned at 9 a.m. The notes seemed like surveillance records. Were my parents monitoring our neighbors? Why? Moreover, I noticed that some objects in the house seemed to move by themselves. One morning, I found the kitchen scissors in my room, next to a piece of cut paper. On another occasion, the books on the shelf were rearranged in a way I never did. They were small changes, but enough to make me paranoid. I knew something was being done without my knowledge, but I couldn't prove anything. My parents' behavior also became increasingly peculiar. My mother, Helen, always so loving and attentive, started to become distant, her eyes avoiding mine in conversations. My father, Mark, who used to enjoy telling funny stories from work, now seemed introspective and often left the house late at night without explanation. When I asked where he was going, his answers were vague. A work commitment, a last-minute meeting. But I knew something was wrong. He always gave me a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. My reaction to these signs was a mixture of curiosity and fear. During the day, I tried to act normally, studying and hanging out with Sarah and Tom, but at night, my mind was filled with unanswered questions. I spent hours mentally reviewing every strange detail, trying to find a pattern or logical explanation. Sarah noticed my change in behavior. "Mike, you seem distant lately. Is everything okay?" She asked one afternoon while we were having ice cream at the square. I hesitated to share my fears, but eventually, I gave in. I told her about the whispered conversations, the mysterious notebook, and the out-of-place objects. She listened attentively, her expression shifting from concern to determination. "We need to find out what's going on. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but if not, you can't deal with this alone." Tom, always the skeptic, tried to calm our worries. "There's probably a logical explanation for all this. Maybe your parents are involved in something big, but not necessarily bad. Let's investigate calmly before jumping to conclusions." Despite Tom's reassuring words, the fear inside me continued to grow. Nights became longer and sleep more scarce. I felt I was on the verge of discovering a terrible truth. But what did it mean for me and my family? Curiosity drove me to continue, but the fear of facing this truth paralyzed me. The line between reality and paranoia began to blur, leaving me trapped in an endless cycle of suspicion and uncertainty. My curiosity finally led me to a discovery that would change everything. I was alone at home on a rainy Saturday afternoon when I decided to search the attic again. I always felt that place held more secrets than I could imagine, and that day, I was determined to uncover the truth. I climbed the stairs and entered the dimly lit attic. The smell of dust and old wood was strong, and the faint light coming through the dirty windows cast dancing shadows on the walls. I went straight to the old wooden chest in the farthest corner, the same one I had rummaged through before. This time, I was determined to look for anything that could clarify my parents' strange behaviors. I carefully removed the dusty objects on top and, at the bottom of the chest, found a heavy metal box with a rusty lock. The box looked old, with signs of wear indicating years of use. My heart started to beat faster. Using a screwdriver I found nearby, I managed to force the lock until it gave way with a snap. When I opened the box, a chill ran down my spine. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, yellowed letters, and old photographs. I started examining the newspaper clippings, and the sense of dread grew with each headline I read. Family disappears without a trace. Another mysterious disappearance alarms community. Police have no leads on series of disappearances. Each clipping detailed a disappearance I vaguely remembered hearing about when I was younger. What scared me the most was that all these articles were from our town, Maplewood. And then, I noticed that some clippings had handwritten notes with dates and locations highlighted, as if someone was monitoring every move of the missing people. Next to the clippings was a pile of threatening letters. The letters were cut from magazines and newspapers, forming chilling messages. We know what you did. You will be next. You cannot escape. The tone of the letters was cold and ruthless, as if written by someone without remorse or fear of being discovered. The most disturbing content, however, was the photographs. Some showed people I recognized, neighbors, acquaintances, even childhood friends, in moments of relaxation, apparently taken from a distance, as if someone was spying on them. Other photos were more sinister, showing faces of people who clearly didn't know they were being photographed, with expressions of fear and despair. One of the photos was of Sarah and Tom, sitting in the park, smiling at the camera. I felt a knot in my stomach seeing my friends there, in the same collection of victims. As I examined the items, a realization hit me. My parents were not only involved in these disappearances, but seemed to be at the center of everything. But why? What motivated them? The questions swirled in my mind, but one thing was clear. I needed to find out more before confronting them or telling anyone. I put the box back in the chest, trying to leave everything exactly as it was, and came down from the attic with a heavy heart and a racing mind. I knew I was now in a dangerous game, where any wrong move could put my life at risk. The curiosity that drove me was now tempered with a real and palpable fear. I needed to be careful, for I was dealing with something much bigger and darker than I could ever have imagined. I decided the next step was to show Sarah and Tom what I had found. I needed allies in my quest for answers. I needed people I could trust. But above all, I needed to maintain the facade of normalcy while the truth unfolded like a nightmare around me. The discovery of the box had deeply shaken me, but it also gave me a clear purpose: to uncover the truth about my parents and the disappearances. From that moment on, my life became a continuous investigation, where every free moment was dedicated to seeking answers. I started investigating the disappearances systematically. I noted all the names, dates, and locations found in the newspaper clippings and notes. I used the school library to research more about each case, diving into old newspaper archives. Each new piece of information reinforced the link between the disappearances and my parents, but also generated more questions. It was like putting together a macabre puzzle, where each piece fit in a disturbing way. The first person I showed my discoveries to was Sarah. I took her to a secluded spot in the park, away from prying eyes, and laid out everything I had found. Her face turned pale as she flipped through the clippings and letters. "This is very serious, Mike. We need to be extremely careful," she said, her voice trembling with concern. Tom, for his part, remained skeptical but agreed to help. "This must be a big coincidence, but we can't ignore the evidence. Let's investigate together and see how far this goes." We decided that the best way to gather more information was to closely observe my parents. We began to spy on them discreetly, taking turns to ensure we didn't raise suspicions. Sarah and Tom made excuses to spend more time at my house, while I kept a detailed diary of all my parents' movements and conversations. One night, while pretending to sleep, I heard my parents leaving the house. I waited a few minutes and then carefully followed them. They walked to an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town, a place that always gave me chills. From a distance, I watched as they entered the shed, their silhouettes disappearing into the darkness. I waited outside, my heart pounding wildly. After what seemed like an eternity, they came out carrying large, heavy bags, which they placed in the trunk of the car. I returned home before them, trying to look as natural as possible. Another tense episode occurred when I found a hidden key in my father's office. The key had a label with the name of a storage unit. Sarah, Tom, and I decided to investigate. On a sunny afternoon, we went to the storage unit, pretending to be curious teenagers. The key opened a unit full of more boxes of documents, all detailing the lives of many people in our town. It was frightening to see the amount of information my parents had collected about everyone around us. Each discovery increased the risk. One day, I was almost caught. I was in my father's office, rummaging through his drawers when I heard footsteps approaching. Quickly, I turned off the light and hid behind the door. My father entered, and for a moment, I was trapped in terrifying silence, holding my breath. He stood there, sensing something, before finally leaving the room. I waited a few more minutes before coming out, my body trembling with nervousness. Despite the dangers, we continued our investigation. We discovered patterns in the disappearances, always occurring after major community events. It seemed my parents used these occasions to select their victims, taking advantage of the confusion and movement. The tension among us increased every day. I pretended normalcy at home, but distrust and fear consumed me. Sarah and Tom were also visibly affected, but we knew we couldn't stop. We were close to something big, something terrible. Then, on a particularly dark night, while we were searching the abandoned shed, we found a hidden room. Inside, there was a wall covered with photographs and maps, with red threads connecting the points. In the center, a photo of my family, with a handwritten note, "Keep under surveillance." The revelation that we were not just observers, but also pieces in my parents' game, changed everything. I realized I was more involved than I ever imagined. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about survival. The game was becoming deadly, and we needed to be ready for anything. The weeks following the discovery of the hidden room in the shed were a whirlwind of emotions and growing fears. Every day that passed, the pressure increased, and my sanity seemed to slip away little by little. Living under the same roof as Mark and Helen, knowing what they might be capable of, was like walking on shards of glass. Every step needed to be calculated, every word carefully measured. But could they do anything to me, even though I'm their son? I thought. My paranoia reached its peak. Every move my parents made seemed suspicious. Every conversation was potentially incriminating. Some nights, I woke up startled, my heart racing, fearing that a sound in the middle of the night was the prelude to something horrible. I started sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow, just to feel a little safer, despite the thought always coming, but they are your parents, they love you, or maybe they don't? The internal conflict was devastating. On one hand, there was the loyalty and love I always felt from my parents. They raised me, took care of me, were my heroes throughout my childhood. I remembered the happy moments, the stories my father told, the warm hugs from my mother. But on the other hand, there was the horror of the discoveries I made. The evidence was clear and irrefutable. The threatening letters, the newspaper clippings, the photographs. Everything pointed to a dark side of Mark and Helen that I could never have imagined. The moral dilemma consumed me. How could I love and fear the same people? How could I trust those who, apparently, were responsible for so much suffering? The idealized image of my parents shattered with each new discovery, and I no longer knew who to trust. My paranoia affected my relationships with Sarah and Tom. I became more distant, fearing that their proximity might put them in danger. Sarah, always perceptive, noticed my change. "Mike, you can't carry this alone. We're in this together," she insisted, trying to comfort me. But I knew that the more we got involved, the greater the risk for all of us. One night, during dinner, my parents were unusually quiet. The silence between us was almost palpable. The clinking of cutlery against plates seemed deafening. Finally, my father looked at me, his eyes fixed on mine. "Michael, you seem very distracted lately. Is everything okay at school?" The question, seemingly innocent, sounded like a veiled accusation. I forced a smile and muttered something about exam stress. But inside, I felt increasingly cornered. The moments of tension were constant. One day, while I was at school, I received a message from Sarah. "We need to talk. Something strange happened." We met at the park, away from prying eyes. Sarah told me she had seen my father talking to an unknown man in the square. They exchanged something quickly, and the man disappeared. "It looked like a secret transaction, Mike. Something is happening, and we need to find out what it is." The loyalty to my parents and the horror of the discoveries continued to tear me apart inside. I felt guilty for suspecting them, for spying and investigating. But the fear and need to protect myself and my friends were stronger. I knew I couldn't go on like this for long. Eventually, I would have to face the truth, confront them, or report what I discovered. But the idea of confronting my parents terrified me. What if they found out I knew? What if they decided I was a threat? The tension culminated one night when I was alone at home. My parents had gone to a community meeting, and I took the opportunity to search my father's office again. While rummaging through his drawers, I found two different keys, one labeled attic and the other basement. My heart raced. What else could be hidden there? I climbed the stairs to the attic, my hands trembling as I opened the door. Inside, I found a small locked room. I used the key and entered, feeling the cold of the stagnant air. In the center of the room was a table with more documents and a laptop. I turned on the laptop, hoping to find answers. What I saw horrified me. There were files detailing each disappearance, with photos, videos, and meticulous notes. As I searched the files, I heard the front door open. My parents were back earlier than I expected. I quickly turned off the laptop and tried to put everything back in place. I came down from the attic, trying to look calm, but I knew something had changed inside me. There was no longer any way to ignore the truth. I was living with killers, and now I had to decide how to deal with it. The tension was becoming unbearable. The first discovery in the attic had already left me disturbed, but the need to find more evidence pushed me to continue. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, and with each step I took, The feeling of being watched grew. My parents seemed more attentive to my movements, and I needed to be more careful than ever. One afternoon, I decided to explore a locked cabinet in the basement, a place that was rarely used and always gave me chills. Using the key I found in my father's office, I unlocked the cabinet, and with a soft click, it opened. The smell of mold and moisture hit me, but what I saw inside made my blood run cold. At the back of the cabinet were a series of boxes labeled with names. Each name was of a missing person. I opened the first box, which was marked with the name Johnson. Inside, I found a wallet, a wristwatch, and a family photo, all personal belongings of the Johnsons, the neighbors who disappeared years ago. The horror overwhelmed me as I opened box after box, each containing personal belongings of other victims. Jewelry, documents, photographs. It was like a macabre museum of trophies. Each object I touched seemed to carry the weight of interrupted lives. My mind spun with questions and terrible scenarios. Why did my parents keep these objects? Were they mementos of their achievements? Or was there something darker behind it all? As I rummaged through the boxes, I heard footsteps upstairs. My heart raced. I knew I had little time before my parents noticed my absence. I quickly closed the boxes and put them back in the cabinet, trying to leave everything as it was before. I climbed the basement stairs as carefully as possible, trying not to make any noise. The basement door creaked as it opened, and as soon as I stepped into the hallway, I came face to face with my father. "What were you doing down there, Michael?" he asked, his cold gaze fixed on me. I thought quickly and forced a smile. "I was looking for an old toy box. I wanted to see if I could find some of my old action figures." He looked at me for what seemed like an eternity before giving a slight smile. "I see. Just don't make too much of a mess. Okay?" I quickly agreed and went up to my room, my heart still pounding in my chest. I closed the bedroom door and sat on the bed, trying to calm my nerves. The feeling of having almost been caught was overwhelming. Every time I got closer to the truth, the risk increased exponentially. I knew my parents were smart and extremely cautious. Any mistake on my part could be fatal. That night, I called Sarah and Tom for an emergency meeting. We met in the park, away from any eavesdroppers. I told them about the second discovery, detailing the personal belongings of the victims I found in the basement. Sarah was visibly shaken. "This is much more serious than we imagined, Mike." "They really are?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what she meant. Tom, though still skeptical, began to realize the gravity of the situation. "We need a plan. We can't just confront them without concrete proof. What if they react violently? We need more evidence, something we can take to the police without a shadow of a doubt." We decided to continue investigating, but with much more caution. Every step needed to be calculated, every movement silent. The paranoia grew every day, and I felt we were getting closer to a final discovery, something that could solve the mystery once and for all. But the fear of being discovered, of facing the true nature of my parents, was a constant weight on my shoulders. Going back home that night, I felt trapped in an endless nightmare. I knew I couldn't continue like this forever. The truth was there, lurking, ready to be revealed. But at what cost? The loyalty to my parents and the horror of what they might be were a constant conflict in my mind. Each discovery, each piece of evidence, was a step closer to the truth and a step closer to imminent danger. The weeks that followed were a real hell. The discovery of the victims' personal belongings in the basement weighed on me like an anchor, dragging me deeper and deeper into the abyss of fear and paranoia. Every move my parents made seemed to be loaded with hidden intentions, and every look they gave me seemed to be a meticulous assessment of my actions. I was losing control over my own sanity, Paranoia infiltrated every aspect of my life. At school, I felt my classmates' gazes like sharp knives. Sarah and Tom noticed the change in me, but I was so consumed by fear that I began to distance myself from them. "Mike, we're worried about you," Sarah said, her eyes full of genuine concern. "You're acting strange. We need to stick together in this." But the truth is, I felt that being close to them only put them in more danger. The weight of the responsibility to protect them was crushing. I started making excuses not to meet, avoiding their calls and messages. I was isolating myself more and more, locked in my room, trying to piece together this macabre puzzle without exposing anyone to danger. My parents, meanwhile, began to notice my change in behavior. Helen, who always had a warm and maternal air, now watched me with disguised concern. "Michael, you've been very reclusive lately. Is everything okay at school? With your friends?" Her voice sounded sweet, but there was an undertone of distrust that I couldn't ignore. Mark, on the other hand, became more direct. One night, he entered my room without knocking, catching me by surprise as I reviewed some notes. "We need to talk, son," he said, closing the door behind him. "I've noticed you've been acting strange. Are you hiding something from us?" My heart raced. It was as if he could read my thoughts, as if he knew I was getting too close to the truth. "No, Dad. I'm just stressed about schoolwork. Nothing major," I replied, trying to stay calm. He looked at me for a long, penetrating moment before getting up and leaving the room. "I hope that's all it is, Michael. Remember, we're family. We can solve any problem together." His words echoed in my mind, a veiled threat hidden under a facade of paternal concern. I knew I was running against time. I needed to find the definitive proof and get out of this situation before my parents discovered how much I knew. The tension at home was palpable. My parents began to watch me more closely. Every time I left the house, I felt their eyes on my back. They asked subtle questions about my movements, trying to find out if I knew more than I should. I answered cautiously, trying not to raise suspicions, but I knew I was walking a very thin line. One particularly tense night, I overheard a conversation between my parents that left me panicked. "He's getting too curious," said my mother. "We need to be more careful." My father responded with a tone that mixed worry and determination. "Yes, we can't take any risks. We need to make a decision soon." These words were the confirmation that they knew I was investigating. I woke up that night in a cold sweat, determined to act. I needed to get out of there. I needed to find a way to escape before it was too late. But how? Where would I go? Who could help me without being dragged into this nightmare? In the midst of all this, there were still Sarah and Tom. I knew I couldn't keep them at a distance for much longer. They were my friends, my anchor to reality. I needed to trust them, but the fear of putting them in danger paralyzed me. Isolation and paranoia were destroying me. Every day seemed a step closer to the abyss, and every night was a battle against the nightmares my mind created. It was becoming hard to distinguish what was real from what was a product of my fear. The truth was there, in front of me, but the courage to face it was slipping away. I needed to act before the tension consumed me completely, but the question that hammered in my mind was, how? And then, one day, something happened that would change the course of everything. An unexpected clue, a fraction of hope, something that would give me the chance to turn the tide and confront the terrifying reality once and for all. The night was especially dark, as if the very shadows conspired against me. I was alone at home. My parents had gone to a community meeting, something that had become a frequent and suspicious event. I took the opportunity to continue my investigation. I decided I needed to go back to the basement and explore more deeply. I descended the stairs with a flashlight in hand, trying not to make any noise. The air was heavy and cold, filled with a sense of despair. I reached the locked cabinet and opened it again, examining the victim's personal belongings. Something led me to search deeper, moving boxes and stacking them aside. It was then that I noticed a loose panel on the wall behind the boxes. With effort, I managed to remove the panel, revealing a narrow, dark passage. My heart was beating frantically, but I knew I needed to go in. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I squeezed through the passage, which seemed to stretch along a narrow corridor. With each step, the tension increased. At the end of the corridor, I found a heavy metal door. I turned the handle carefully, hoping it wasn't locked. To my surprise, the door opened with a sinister creak. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It was a concrete room, cold and devoid of windows, illuminated only by a hanging lamp. On the walls were photographs of the victims, some with disturbing details about their lives and disappearances. In the center of the room, a stainless steel table was covered with surgical instruments and dark stains that I preferred not to identify. But what truly terrified me was the bulletin board next to the table, where there was a list of names. At the top of the list, highlighted in red, was my name, Michael. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. My parents were watching me, controlling me. I was next. Panic took over me, but before I could react, I heard voices approaching. I ran back through the narrow corridor, trying to reach the basement before they caught me. I stumbled and nearly fell, but managed to compose myself and exit the passage, closing the panel behind me. I hid behind some boxes, my breathing quick and shallow. My parents entered the basement, their voices low and concerned. "We need to get rid of him before he finds out too much," I heard my father say. My mother responded, "We have to be careful. He's smarter than we thought." I was paralyzed with fear, my suspicions finally confirmed in a horrifying way. They really were killers, and I was next on the list. I needed to get out of there, but every move seemed impossible. Then, they began to climb the stairs, and I took the opportunity to run towards the front door. I left the house as fast as I could, without looking back. I ran to the park where Sarah and Tom were waiting, knowing I needed to tell them everything. When I arrived, my appearance must have said it all. Sarah ran to me. "Mike, what happened? You look pale. Everything we suspected is true. My parents, they are killers, and I'm next." The words came out trembling, almost inaudible. Tom tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to go to the police now. There's no time to lose." I agreed, but knew that time was against us. My parents wouldn't wait to act, and I needed to protect my friends. We grabbed our bikes and pedaled as fast as we could to the police station. On the way, my thoughts were in turmoil, but one thing was clear. The truth had finally been revealed, and now everything depended on surviving the night. We pedaled to the police station, the cold night wind cutting our faces as our hearts raced frantically. When we arrived, I was about to go in and tell the police everything when I felt a firm hand on my shoulder. I turned to see my father, Mark, with a serious and intense look. Next to him was my mother, Helen, her expression equally somber. "Michael, we need to talk," said my father, his voice harder than I had ever heard. Sarah and Tom froze, not knowing how to react. "Now," he added, making it clear there was no room for negotiation. Reluctantly, we followed my parents to a nearby alley, away from prying eyes. Fear and adrenaline pulsed through my veins as I prepared to confront them with the evidence. "I know what you are," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw the victim's belongings, the threatening letters, and the list with my name. How could you do this?" To my surprise, my parents exchanged a significant look before turning their attention back to me. "Michael, You don't understand the full situation, said my mother, her voice softer than I expected. We've been undercover for years, trying to catch a serial killer. I was stunned, not knowing what to think. What? Was all I could say. We're federal agents, my father continued, as he and my mother took wallets from their pockets, showing their badges. We've been on a secret mission for years. All the evidence you found are proofs we're collecting to catch the real killer. The revelation left me speechless. All the fear, paranoia, distrust, it all crumbled in an instant. But what about the disappearances and the personal belongings? I asked, trying to piece it all together. The disappearances are real, Michael, my mother explained, but we're not the ones behind them. We're trying to find the person responsible. The boxes with personal belongings are proofs we've recovered from the crime scenes. We need to keep everything secret to protect the investigation. If you discovered our mission, it could jeopardize everything, added my father. That's why we became more vigilant. We knew you were getting too close to the truth. I looked at Sarah and Tom, who were also in shock. What about us? Asked Sarah, still trying to process everything. Did you know we were helping Mike? Yes, said my father, and we're grateful for that. But now we need your cooperation. You must swear not to tell anyone about what you discovered. Any slip-up could compromise years of work and put lives at risk. If you say anything to anyone, some information could fall into the wrong hands. Then you would not only be compromising the mission, but also your own lives, said my mother. The killer we're looking for is extremely dangerous. Any leak of information could lead to terrible consequences. Sarah and Tom looked at me, waiting for my decision. We needed to make the oath. We promise, I said. I promise too, added Sarah, holding my hand. I swear, said Tom, his voice firm. My parents nodded, relieved. Thank you, said my father. Now, we need you to continue as if nothing happened. We're close to catching the killer, and we need to keep everything under control. As we returned home, I felt a mix of relief and incredulity. The truth had been revealed, but what did it mean for us? I had confronted my parents with what I thought was a deadly accusation, only to discover they were protecting the community all along. In the days that followed, I began to adjust back to reality. The sense of relief in discovering that my parents were not the monsters I feared was immense. They were heroes, agents dedicated to a secret mission to capture a dangerous killer. Life at home stabilized, and the tension decreased significantly. I returned to focusing on my studies and spending time with Sarah and Tom, who now also knew the truth about my parents. The friendship between us became even stronger. We continued to meet at the park, laughing and talking as before, but with a new understanding of the secrets we kept. Sarah, always curious, still asked questions about my parents' mission. So what happens now? Do they have any leads on the killer? My parents said they're closer than ever, but they can't share many details. They still need to keep everything secret until they can arrest the culprit, I replied, trying to keep the conversation light despite the gravity of the situation. Tom, for his part, was more cautious. We need to be careful. We know things we shouldn't. Better to keep our lives as normal as possible. And so we did. I returned to school regularly, participated in extracurricular activities, and began to value more the simple and everyday moments. My parents also made an effort to resume an appearance of normalcy, participating in community events and maintaining their routines. Family nights became less tense, and the specter of fear that hung over us began to dissipate. However, there was still a killer in the town. We knew he was on the loose, and that my parents' mission was not over. I remained alert, always aware of my surroundings, and my parents taught me some additional security measures. One day, While walking down Maplewood's Main Street, I saw a poster of a new missing person. But that's a story for another time. If you like this story, subscribe to the channel and check out the next story playing on the screen.